Greetings. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It's good to see a full room. Good to see everybody here. I am very honored to be visiting. This is so the book was just published in 2025 in May, so just a few months ago. So it's brand new, and this is my first time publicly speaking about the book. So I'm very honored and appreciate the opportunity. I wanted to thank the Abu Sulaiman Center for inviting me and hosting me and giving me this opportunity to speak with you all about it and I'm very excited to get your thoughts, feedback, questions, reactions, constructive critique. Maybe less constructive critique is okay as well. And I want to thank the team of people who made this possible, made my arrangements, Aisha Noor, Kara, Sarah Ashur, and specifically I want to extend my special gratitude to the director of the center, Peter Mandeville, as well as Ahmed Tegalulu, not just for inviting me for this talk, but also making arrangements for me in 2019, 2020 to 2021, offering a visiting research fellow position and inviting me to give a talk during COVID virtually, all of which were part of the process of developing the manuscript that led to this book. So that support was very invaluable, and I really appreciate coming back full circle. That was the very beginning process of drafting things after my dissertation, and now the first book talk I'm giving. So thank you, Ahmed, and everybody. So Bismillah. Where's the slides? This is... All right. Let me begin with a story that was shared with me many years ago as I was first beginning to conceive of this project. And I'll tell you more about the context in which I heard that story. But I will begin with Nadia. Nadia was at the mosque in her hometown, somewhere in the south, sitting with the other dozen or so women, several rows behind the men in the mosque, listening to the guest speaker's lecture. As the imam concluded his main remarks, he opened it up to questions from the community. Nadia was only about 16 years old, a junior in high school, and she, jotted down her question on a half sheet of paper and passed it up to the front of the room. Eventually, the imam got to her question and began to read it out loud. A sister is asking, why do men have to be in charge and in leadership positions? His voice got softer as he went along, turning more into a murmur. How is it okay for a man to hit his wife? Why does the Quran allow this? He paused for a moment and began to respond with his thoughts on the naturalness of Islamically defined gender roles, but then stopped mid-sentence and shifted gears. Look, sister, this kind of questioning is dangerous. You can't pick and choose from Islam. You have to accept it as a whole. Allah is our creator with infinite knowledge and wisdom, and He has given us this guidance. So when we accept that this has been revealed to us from Allah, we must accept it all, as it is. Nadia listened. She told me with a blank face. A lump formed in her throat, but she hid her hurt and her disappointment. This wasn't the first time that Nadia would receive such a message around this point in her life. She had been struggling to make sense of some of the kind of authoritative teachings on gender that were propagated in her community. And these ideas of gendered nature and roles conflicted with her experience or her sense of self, and as well as her intuitive sense of right and wrong. But in the face of these reservations, she felt constantly bombarded with the claim that one couldn't arrogantly determine for themselves what aspects of Islam were correct and not. Whether it was listening to sermons online of popular preachers on YouTube or asking elders, that she loved about, these issues and being told to repent for, expressing such thoughts, there seemed to be around her at least this consensus that one couldn't challenge these teachings, couldn't believe the things that she felt she believed, and still be Muslim. So after hearing the imam's response to her questions at the mosque that evening, Nadia thought to herself, well, okay, if that's the case, I know I can't accept these things, and I will never be able to accept these things. So then maybe I don't accept Islam. This train of thought led her to consciously decide at that time, maybe that evening, that she no longer accepted the truth of Islam, the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad, or God. She soon after the lecture began to see herself, she said, as an atheist. So, before I share with you the rest of Nadia's story, and the twist in the plot, so to speak, let me pause for a minute and just share with you how I came to hear this story from her, and what brought me to even have this conversation with her and do this research, and how my story came to intersect with hers. So Nadia first shared this story with me in 2013, while sitting on the floor of my apartment living room. A few years, when she's telling me the story, a few years were separating her from the events that she was telling me about. And when she recounted the experience to me, she was in her early 20s, nearing the completion of her undergraduate degree at Duke University, which is where I was pursuing my PhD in religious studies. And what the interesting thing is that I hadn't gotten to know Nadia over the course of the previous couple of years, not as an atheist, or not as an ex-Muslim, or even not as a secular or cultural Muslim for the most part. She was a very engaged member of her campus Muslim community. She was an active and regular participant, not just in social and educational events and programs, but also in ritual and devotional programming. She would attend Jummah, the Friday prayers. She would go to Quran halaqas regularly, study circles where reading the Quran, go to spiritual retreats that the MSA organized, and even Qiyam al-Layl programming, like ritual kind of practice at night, like after midnight. So how did this conversation come up? In the several years prior to this exchange with her, I had gone myself through a number of complex struggles in my relationship with Islam and my faith. I grew up very deeply immersed in a world of Islamic devotional practice and learning, but at least since the summer before college, I started grappling more consciously with feelings of doubt, crisis. There are many stages. It's a very long, complex story. You might not be interested in it. Many spiritual and emotional highs and lows throughout this process, sometimes happening at the same time. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that. If you're interested, I could share a bit more during Q&A. But for now, the point being is that because of this personal trajectory of my own, I began to increasingly encounter and interact and talk to a significant number of young Muslims who, like Nadia, were struggling with their relationship with Islam, their faith, and the confusion they had. And in fact, in 2012, my wife and I, who were both at Duke, had just started this kind of closed group, struggling with faith, kind of reading and support group through the MSA. And Nadia was a participant in that group. So it was in that way that I had gotten to know her, not just as somebody who was actively involved in religious life on campus, but also somebody who anxiously grappled with many difficult questions in her faith. It seemed obvious that she took her religious commitment very seriously, but with this commitment came a lot of insecurity and doubts. At the same time, beyond my own experiences personally and my encounters with others, I was also increasingly observing concerns with doubt and a crisis of faith taking center stage at the national level. With American Muslim public discourse, it was becoming more and more common to find kind of open public expressions of questioning by people in the Muslim community, especially online, and more preachers and community leaders bringing like urgent attention to this as a problem, as a phenomenon that we had to address. So these circumstances coming together, my personal life, being interpersonal relations, public discourse, gave birth to the basic questions that animated this book. How do U.S. Muslims, U.S. Muslim communities and individuals relate and respond to the problem of doubt? What gives rise to the pressures and anxieties that we see about belief? And how is faith understood and lived out in the absence of confident conviction about authoritative doctrinal truths? And I was conducting preliminary research at the time just to try to conceptualize this project, to try to write a dissertation proposal. And so I was doing some preliminary research before actually doing my formal field work that led to this book. And it was that context that I spoke to Nadia in that October evening in 2013. So let me come back to her story now. After she comes to this point, she tells me that she, began to see herself as an atheist. She paused, and, running a hand through her hair, she briefly interjected, "Well, I don't know if I still believed. I did come back, so maybe I did. I don't know." Her comment caught me off guard by surprise. I wondered, what could it mean to believe in something even when you consciously think you don't? But Nadia didn't explain what she meant, and I didn't get a chance to ask her at the time. I did, 9 years later. She just continued with her story, jumping forward to how she regained her faith during her first year in college, a year or so after the event at the mosque. So during Ramadan that year, she told me, she had taken to sitting alone in the woods from time to time. She recalled feeling very alone and empty inside, she said, during this period of time. And in one such outing, something she had come across inspired her to read the following verses from the Quran, from Surah Al-Duha. One translation might be, "By the morning light and by the night when it grows still, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor does he hate you, and the future will be better for you than the past. Your Lord is sure to give you so much that you will be well satisfied. Did he not find you an orphan and shelter you? Did he not find you lost and guide you? Did he not find you in need and make you self-sufficient? So, do not be harsh with the orphan, and do not chide the one who asks for help, and proclaim the blessings of your Lord." So Nadia said she was overtaken by emotion when she read these verses, sitting in the Duke Woods, or whatever they're called, Duke Garden, I don't remember. She felt like these verses spoke very deeply to her internal struggles, her sense of loss, and it revealed a picture of God that she realized she was longing for, and she did believe in, whatever her reservations otherwise. Her conscious faith in God, therefore, and in the Quran were rekindled, motivating her to try to reconnect with Islam. So even though after this point she started regaining a relationship of devotional practice and commitment to God, she hadn't found any resolution for the problems that she had initially led her to feel like she couldn't believe, she couldn't be Muslim. She hadn't gotten any more clarity about how to reconcile her deep commitment to women's equality, on the one hand, with either scriptural statements or orthodox doctrine that seemed to contradict this commitment. She hadn't clarified how she understood the nature and authority of divine revelation, or what the foundational declaration of faith required of her to accept. Like the Imam seemed to suggest that she had to. If you make this declaration of faith, all these things follow. You have to know all of that. In fact, rather than resolving or gaining clarity about these matters that had been deemed before absolutely foundational and essential, she told me she had decided to largely avoid thinking about the things that troubled her, so that she could instead focus on her devotional practice and her relationship with God. But at the same time, gradually over time, I also observed Nadia gradually re-engaging with religious discourse. She began to expend significant time and energy grappling with Islamic doctrine, shifting her understanding of the interpretive possibilities available to Muslims and how they approach and understand Islamic tradition. So she no longer saw the dominant religious discourse she grew up with as the only possible interpretation of Islam. So over time she became more confident in her own relationship to Islam and felt less of a pressing need to reconcile herself with authoritative discourses or texts. So ambiguity and ambivalence were a key characteristic of Nadia's experience of faith during this transition. She wasn't convinced that her reservations indicated a lack of belief. I'm just going to skip this little bit about stuff she was working through at the time, just so that I make sure I can cover other points. So in any case, the point here is that it seemed to me that Nadia no longer felt compelled by the idea that being Muslim and having faith meant that she necessarily must have some fully authentic state of belief, that her affirmation and commitment to Islam had to be reflected unequivocally in her internal feelings and convictions. So she no longer felt like that had to be that complete, internal consistency. And at the same time, she had found her own relationship to Islam that felt more authentic to her, and thus served as the basis of her faith commitment. And so here's the heart of the matter, where the title of the book starts to kind of become apparent, Dilemmas of Authenticity. There's dilemmas of what it means to be an authentic person, an authentic believer or Muslim. Because on the one hand, this kind of demand of authentic faith she was pushing against, and on the other hand, there's a certain idea of like an authentic relationship that she was holding on to. And I'll come back to and explain this a bit more fully later. But let me step back from this story for a few minutes and just contextualize. So part of the point in sharing Nadia's story is that it exemplifies the pervasive anxieties around the crisis of faith within American Muslim communities. So this is both individual experiences, people who express uncertainty and ambivalence and critique, disillusionment in relation to religious belief, but also the communal public discourse. So religious authorities and communities expressing a sense of an epidemic of Muslims losing their faith and identity. So when I started my doctoral work in 2010, until while I was through writing this book throughout the whole decade, it seemed that more and more Muslim community leaders couldn't stop talking about a kind of a nationwide crisis of faith, that people are losing their conviction in Islam or have serious doubts, etc. And so this led to the development of all sorts of institutions, platforms trying to address this problem. A very extensive, pervasive kind of sense of increasing discourse about this in all sorts of ways, local community events, etc. So my book examines this concern with crisis of faith at two levels. First, I present an ethnographic account of Muslim narratives of doubt based on 2 years of fieldwork in Boston. Ethnographic means kind of as a method of like deep hanging out. So spending time with people, interacting with them, seeing how they're living life and the kinds of issues that are coming up. So through a kind of extended dialogue with an array of conversation partners, I examine some common trajectories involved in religious questioning and how individuals navigate and respond to doubt, and how they understand their relationship to Islam in the face of these reservations. And at the second level, the book is tracing prominent public discourses on belief and doubt and crisis of faith that are taking place within influential networks of American Islam. And so I put these two levels in conversation with them. The kind of personal conversations I was having in Boston with kind of broader national public discourses in the Muslim community. So stories like Nadia's and these kind of growing communal anxieties about young Americans leaving their faith bring up concerns and ideas about secularization. Whether people fear or hope for, whether they see it as a positive or negative thing, there's a sense that we live in an increasingly secularized culture that makes it very difficult to believe or have faith. And in some ways, this is, an accurate picture of what is happening in some respects, but also doesn't fully capture the picture. And it could be, we could see how it can be slightly more ambiguous than that in ways that shed light on, the narrative I'm trying to tell in this book. So on the one hand, it is the case that in the past few decades, there's been a dramatic and unprecedented rise in the number of Americans who do not identify with any religion. So these religiously unaffiliated people are often called the nones. They check on a box, none, when they're asked about religious identity. And this has been steadily increasing in survey results since the 1990s and reaching in recent years about a third of the population. And when you look at generational shifts between boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Gen Z, the difference, the kind of the rise of this phenomenon is even more stark. And there's lots of other trends one can look at. But this kind of trend of disaffiliation is one of the clearest signs and indications that there's some really serious shifts happening in terms of how people relate to religion. One could ask, does this apply to, in what way does it apply to Muslims? And the big picture, while a lot of times a lot of the data seems to point to how this is very much something that affects, white Christianity, or particularly among liberal mainline Protestant denominations and Catholics. Because evangelicals and black Christians have mostly maintained stable numbers. Some groups have grown slightly, like Muslims and Hindus. But that growth doesn't mean that they're not; those groups aren't leaving their traditions. It simply indicates overall growth through birth rates, immigration, and conversion, and those offset the number of people leaving those religions. So, American Muslim organizations like the Yaqeen Institute, which was one of those kind of platforms that was founded to address this concern, they often kind of cite this statistic from a Pew study that says that 1 in 5 Muslims who grew up in the U.S. have left their faith. And so even though the overall number of Muslims is not declining, there is some clear evidence of instability under the surface. But the other thing to think about is that if you examine these trends carefully, you find that many studies have pointed out that the statistics in question about the rise of the kind of disaffiliation doesn't indicate a straightforward move away from religion, or that those religiously unaffiliated people exhibit a total lack of engagement with religious traditions and communities or spiritual concerns and practices. So the people who check none, the vast majority of them actually, rather than complete disinterest or antagonism to any kind of religion or spirituality in any form, a lot of studies show that a substantial portion of them are engaging in some way with religious traditions and ideas and practices and communities in these very highly individualized or ambivalent fashion. They don't feel bound by formally authorized or institutionalized forms of religious belonging and observance. And in fact, you kind of witness this explosion of new forms of spirituality, what one author calls a kaleidoscopic panoply of spiritual traditions, rituals, and subcultures. Another author calls a spiritual marketplace and a quest culture, with a great emphasis placed on individual seeking and fluidity, pragmatic and therapeutic modes of spirituality, as well as heightened attention to inwardness, subjectivity, the experiential, the expressive, spiritual. So I'll come back to the significance of this growing religious individualism in a bit, once I come back to the central argument of the book. But for now, one thing to know is, one could call all of this a very secular kind of spirituality or religiosity, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree. But the point is that, simply put, when I say it's not necessarily straightforwardly secularization that we see happening around us in the American context, I mean that many of the trends show it's not so much that people are no longer believing or having any attachment to a kind of an idea of God in some sense, or a higher power or transcendence or the supernatural as such. That doesn't seem to be the primary kind of crux of the issue. People are open to engaging that, but what we see is the destabilization of what we tend to call organized religion or traditional religion, maybe traditional like monotheistic theologies and authority structures and doctrines, etc. And this was reflected in the kind of research, the ethnographic work, the kind of conversation partners and community members I was talking to in Boston. It was rarely the abstract, like, plausibility of God, like the existence of God, or skepticism about the supernatural, and related issues that was like leading people to express like a deep sense of crisis or uncertainty about their faith. Rather, what I kind of show in the book and the kinds of stuff that emerged is that it's really the kind of questioning and anxieties we see is much more in relation to various kinds of moral values, norms, ethics, particularly where Islamic doctrines were seen to clash with liberal or humanistic values. So that's kind of one aspect of what is going on here. But I also want to clarify that I'm not trying to identify, like, I don't try in this book to identify and diagnose, like, what's the source of doubt? Like, why are people having these doubts? Where's the dissonance or uncertainty they're having coming from? Because the thing is, at some level that seems a bit more, like, we can see, it's a bit more straightforward and obvious at a certain level to identify all the things that cause people to feel disillusioned with religion, or with Islam in particular. it's also impossible to fully capture. There's such a kind of vast array of factors, the full complexity of like century of development. So people can tell those stories of what is it that is leading to people to kind of feel conflicted or disillusioned with religion. And that's not really what I'm getting at. And similarly, there's a lot that can be said about the debates and conflicting interpretations of Islam. How do Muslims debate amongst themselves how to interpret certain teachings and verses of the Quran, or how to approach contemporary values in relation to Islam? And this is something that is very much more commonly discussed. There's a vast array of literature out there, and the subject of entire libraries, really, of modern Islamic thought. And I couldn't possibly cover all that in a constructive way. So I'm not trying to say what is giving rise to these conflicts of interpretation. Instead, I'm trying to think about what brings doubt and uncertainty and ambivalence or lack of full conviction to the fore of people's consciousness. What makes it so troubling and makes it into a crisis? So for me, as I see it, crisis and doubt, even though a lot of times those are used interchangeably, for me, a sense of crisis and doubt are not synonymous. A lack of full certainty about things is probably a given, especially in our cultural landscape for a lot of people. We probably, if one digs beneath the surface, or probably people have doubts about moral commitments and values and things that structure our life, where they don't fully have everything worked out in their head in a systematic way, if we're going to be more aware of them. But there aren't necessarily, with all of our commitments, the conditions that make these doubts really apparent and don't force us to kind of focus on them so much that it causes a sense of crisis. So the question is, what makes us so aware of doubts and uncertainties about religion and creates such an acute sense of anxiety and even crisis? That's kind of the angle that I'm trying to take in this book, to kind of offer and that's where the argument about the dilemmas of authenticity come in, is that there's certain kind of pressures that makes people a lot more aware of these dissonances and doubts that causes a sense of crisis. So that brings me to the kind of central argument, and returning to Nadia's story. So one way to understand that is that there's two kinds of authenticity in the way, authenticity of tradition and authenticity of self. So usually when we talk about authenticity in relation to Islam, we usually mean the authenticity of tradition, this first kind. So this is authenticity is usually a judgment of like the realness of something. Is the thing real or fake? So it could be in relation to tangible objects, like is this diamond real? Are these Jordans real, or are they fake? It could be an cultural entity like a cuisine. Is this authentic Thai food or not? Is this real black culture or not? And so this is usually what we mean when we refer to Islamic authenticity. Is it really Islam that is this practice or belief faithfully reflect Islamic teachings? Does it fit normative expectations and standards of what classifies something as Islamic? In this sense, judgments of authenticity are basically like claims of like orthodoxy, essentially. And we see a clear expression of this in Nadia's story, in that the idea that there's this very clear body of doctrines that are genuinely, authentically Islamic, she is told, and that purely reflect the guidance of God and the teachings of Islam, and they have to be accepted. But we also see in Nadia's story a different sense of authenticity, and this is what emerged as kind of the central theme of my research and the book. And this is an ethos of personal authenticity, the authenticity of self, an ethic that emphasizes what it means to be true to one's own self. So here the realness is about the realness of you internally. And so the ethic here is about living in accordance with your true self. So in our, culture, this ethos of personal authenticity, I think, is very apparent to all of us. It's become, in the 21st century, an arguably inescapable feature and almost hegemonic frame of American cultural life, such that we can speak of living in an age of authenticity. Consider the pervasive language of being authentic to your real self in so many ways. be yourself, you do you, think for yourself. And from self-help and therapeutic discourse to corporate advertising to entertainment to identity politics, this ethos is everywhere. It's pervasive. And when we speak about a cultural drive or ideal of personal authenticity, we're dealing with an entire constellation of interconnected values and concepts that take on an immense ethical significance in people's lives. Autonomy, choice, self-trust, interiority, introspection, sincerity and conscience, self-expression and individuality, self-knowledge and self-realization. All these are like such fundamental values for us culturally. So there's the other central component, and so of my argument. I won't get into it now. If people are interested, I can get into it in question and answer just for the sake of time. But part of the argument, the story I'm telling in my book is that this ethos of personal authenticity intersects and converges also with a kind of ethos of Islamic revivalism. And again, I'll unpack that further in class, but in discussion. But basically, the developments of movements of Islamic revival that has really influenced American Muslim modes of piety, that is kind of a default understanding of what it means to be Muslim, have their own version of a sense of personal authenticity that converges and conflicts in certain ways with this dominant liberal ethos. And I can, again, explain that a bit more clearly in discussion. But basically what we see then is that the Islamic revivalist imperative of what it means to be to really be Muslim, as well as the liberal imperative of what it means to really be an individual, both really center personal authenticity in a way that make doubt a problem. In an age of personal authenticity, that is, the ideal of sincere faith or genuine commitment to something can translate into a very intense pressure of self-scrutinizing awareness and feeling conflicted. So a lot of self-scrutiny, self-introspection. So we see this, let me just explain that by unpacking how that plays out in Nadia's story that I started out with in the beginning. On the one hand, Nadia's doubts and discomforts initially led her to feel that she had to reject Islam, because these reservations and ambivalence indicated a lack of sincere and authentic belief. So there's this sense that she's internalized this sense, and if she's not fully convinced or at home with key authoritative teachings, means that one should just reject that form of life entirely, because you shouldn't adhere to something if you're not genuinely committed. That's being inauthentic. It's kind of false consciousness. How are you adhering to something when internally it doesn't really reflect your true convictions? In this way, the desire for authenticity amounts to a requirement of inner wholeness and consistency, a demand that she eventually comes to reject. She implicitly is moves away from that kind of expectation. But on the other hand, Nadia's narrative of regaining faith also depends on an ethic of authenticity, insofar as she prioritizes a certain kind of authentic personal experience and feeling over doctrinal or intellectual concerns. So she's saying, these feelings I have, this sentiment of devotion and love, are identified for her as the authentic core of her relationship to Islam and are more definitive than these authoritative doctrines. So her appeal to her devotional experience creates room for her to more confidently affirm her own personally authentic relationship to Islam that is kind of separate from communal expectations and orthodoxies. So, the central kind of framework of the book then, and I kind of shared the abstract kind of framework and not the stories, but maybe we can get into some of the stories because a lot of the book is ethnographic stories of people. But the central framework and argument then is that the drive to personal authenticity is at the heart of this American crisis of faith. The story here isn't just that the demands of personal authenticity and faith commitment are in tension. It's not just that personal authenticity leads people away from faith. It's not that straightforward. The emphasis on personal authenticity also provides people compelling ground to affirm their faith or to affirm pious commitment and religious identity, despite the dissonances that they experience. This is why it's not a straightforward story of secularization. This kind of growth of religious individualism that I was talking about earlier, you see it not just leading away from religiosity, but producing all sorts of results. So we see how the imperative of authenticity can produce in people a sense of crisis, but also serve as the grounds to affirm tradition. And so and it kind of produces all sorts of dilemmas in people. The expectation, this discourse of being true to yourself is ambiguous. It's not very clear what it demands, and so it kind of produces this hyper-scrutiny that produces a lot of dilemmas as well. And that is the explanatory key, I think, for understanding why doubt becomes a source of intense anxiety and crisis, as well as it helps understand how people are being able to maintain their faith commitment despite such unsettling feelings of doubt or uncertainty. Let me just conclude. I'm about at time, but just take a couple minutes to just say a couple words in conclusion about what do we take from this? What are some of the lessons I've learned through this process of interacting with people, learning from people, writing, researching, about individuality and community, how I came to kind of conclude the book in my own mind. A lot of the writing for this happened during the COVID pandemic, alongside, BLM protests and all sorts of instability in the political climate. And so the context in which I wrote and rewrote the book made the relationship between individuality and community a very urgent concern for me. Because the pandemic made a lot of us recognize the necessity of communal interdependence, that we have to rely on community. But being in community is not always very easy. It raises questions of what does it take to actually be in community with others and share a form of life with others, share a political project with others, a way of doing things. And what do we do when we inevitably confront the failings of a collective movement or a community or a tradition that we're generally aligned with? We generally find ourselves committed to, but we're struggling with it. How do we respond to the ways in which this collective might constrain us, or where there are issues within a movement that we have serious reservations about? Does the dissonance always lead to disillusion, frustration, and abandonment of a community? What do we have to put up with to sustain communal modes of living? And how can an ethic that respects individual autonomy and authenticity still allow for collectively shared goals and purpose? And the reason why I say this is that so as I was writing and rewriting this book many times, this theme took on a lot of center stage for me in my concerns. And I realized that to examine the crisis of faith and the challenge of doubt was to examine what it means to be in community with people. So what my interlocutors, my conversation partners and friends that are in the pages of this book, what they struggled with was the tension between their individual sensibilities and the authoritative norms of a tradition or a community that they felt an allegiance to. The Muslim community has a claim upon them that they feel bound by, but they also resist in certain ways. So they exemplified this dance very well. The people in this book exemplify self-trust while also being embedded in a community. They're constantly struggling with these dilemmas of authenticity, as I put it. And as thinking about that kind of ethos I felt like what this book and what my interlocutors taught me was a kind of nuanced attitude towards this ethic of authenticity, or the kind of individualism that we see around us that can guide our relationship to community. The stories of my interlocutors model what it might mean to uphold one's commitment to a form of life despite uncertainty, ambivalence, hesitation, and frustration. Because I argue that this kind of inner dissonance and fragmentation is to a great degree inevitable in our world. It's important, therefore, to be able to acknowledge and live with such doubt without it leading to a debilitating sense of crisis. It's crucial that we be able to face such ambivalence without the need to either suppress questioning and just get in line with what we're being told, or to see such reservations as requiring us to abandon commitment or action or engagement in a collective moral project. So that's kind of more broadly, beyond just the kind of the question of faith, and was some of the lessons that I took away more broadly than that. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.